From Alderman and Company, Bill Alderman. From Morgan Stanley, Kristine Liwag. And from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Ron Epstein.
Good morning, everybody. So I think we're going to do this as a bit of a moderated panel. So I'm going to moderate it and maybe sprinkle in a little stuff here and there. And our panel members will be Bill and Kristine. Bill I think it's important. Bill's the founder and principal at Alderman and Company, which is a mezzanine level investment bank. And Kristine is an executive director at Morgan Stanley, and she is the head aerospace and defense analyst for the Americas, right? Yeah. And we're all good friends. Kristine and I go back a long way, so this should be a lot of fun. Some of the themes we're going to hit are themes that Richard has already talked about, and I think came up a bit yesterday. So let's kick this off on a couple things. Let's talk about inflation first. Richard brought that up. The impact of inflation, raw material prices, labor shortages. So let me go to Kristine first. I mean, what's your perspective on that from an investor perspective?
Sure. From the investor perspective, aerospace and defense ownership of active managers as tracked by Morgan Stanley is at 15-year trough. So investors are not owning the aerospace and defense sector yet. And talking to investors today, what they want to know is when will aerospace and defense companies generate the same type of cash flow that they generated pre-COVID and also pre-max grounding? And right now, even though aerospace and defense is the largest subsector of the industrials GICS, larger than machinery, larger than multi-industrials building products, the expectation is that as volumes recover because of production rates from Boeing and Airbus, and as aftermarket picks up, they'll start generating all that cash. And today, inflation, raw material prices, labor shortages are not priced in any of the consensus numbers of expectations. So if we start seeing this where instead of margins going up, margins actually become flat or shrink, I mean, there are going to be more disincentives to own the sector than incentives. And I think that that's not priced in at all.
Gotcha. And maybe just one quick follow-on. What's your sense between ownership in commercial versus ownership in defense? Because in some cases, it's kind of like two sectors.
Yeah, so the data doesn't split between the two, but for defense, it's been that some funds might own one defense name, just in case of something bad happening. And in 2021, that wasn't the case because the expectation is you've got a democratic sweep across the government. You don't necessarily need to own defense. In 2022, that's starting to change, especially with the news regarding Ukraine and Russia, that maybe you can own a defense stock. And defense primes are trading at a 20% discount to the S&P 500. And with Richard's chart earlier, we're seeing RDT&E and procurement going up. So there's more interest to own defense today with this defensive view. And then for aerospace, a lot of folks are still sitting on the sidelines.
And Bill, transitioning to you, let's bring you in the conversation. What's your sense? I mean, what's this for your clients, suppliers? What's it mean for day-to-day operations? And just to remind everybody here, so Kristine's role, her fiduciary responsibility is to investors, and then Bill's on the other side of the wall, where his responsibility is to the companies. So, I mean, from the company perspective, what's your sense?
On inflation specifically, right?
Yeah, inflation. So, and raws and labor, yeah.
Okay. And I'll add one little piece of clarification. Whereas the two of these are dealing with multi-billion-dollar companies and in some cases larger than that funds, we deal deep in the supply chain where many of you live, a company that has 200 employees. Those are our kinds of clients. And so that's the perspective. And so from that perspective, Ron, and in our core work of sell-side M&A, right, selling those companies, what we're seeing now and started to see about 3 or 4 months ago was buyers are looking at the projections and where they're doing due diligence, and before they would ask about your LTAs, your contracts, your prices. Typically they wanted to know how much you would guarantee Boeing on a price de-escalation, right? That's what was in the contracts. Today, what they're looking for is what's your protection? And we're in a deal right now selling a wonderful company, very profitable, doing fine, but the projections are getting questioned by the buyer, who is looking and saying, we just saw a 62% increase in your aluminum stock, and you have aluminum content. What's your protection? And without getting into the specifics of that deal, those questions, especially you have a 62% increase in an input cost. I haven't seen that. I mean, we've been doing this 21 years as this firm. I've been doing this 30 years. I can remember the prime rate being 20%, right? You can too. Kristine, you're too young. But Ron, you can remember.
I'm older than I look.
You're still too young. But prime was 20%. I don't remember people saying you got inputs going up 62% a year.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully, Richard's right. That's transitory, and we're trying to work through that on this specific deal. But I haven't seen that in 30 years.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe the next subject related to inflation, the kind of sisters or brothers, if you will, is interest rates. So we're in an environment where clearly interest rates are going up. And just to be clear, if you look at economists on the street, the expectations for the Fed raising rates go anywhere from 3 rate hikes to 7. 25 basis points here. Some people are talking about 50 basis points. And the point is, so the economists on the street, the view on interest rates is it's a wide window. Translation, nobody knows what's going to happen. So what's your sense? Why don't we go back to Kristine on the impact what's that mean for financing aircraft? What's your sense on what that means for just commercial aviation markets?
Yeah, I mean, pre-COVID, aircraft capital costs, so that's rent or their mortgage, is about 10% of U.S. airlines' total cost, right? And then this is before the labor inflation. Labor was 20%, oil was another 20%. So aircraft capital costs were actually pretty small as a percent of that. And so if we're talking about interest rate increases of 25 basis point or 50 basis point, I mean, it doesn't really move the needle a whole lot. The concern is if you start going to the high single digit, and maybe 80s when I was born, Bill, the teens, which I don't remember, I was a baby, that kind of interest rate, that matters. Because 40-50% of the global fleet today is owned by aircraft leasing companies, and aircraft lessors generally have investment grade credit ratings. And when credit markets tighten, the spread between the borrowing costs of investment grade and high yield just widen. And so for airlines, the capital cost becomes more expensive, and that's probably good for the aircraft leasing companies because they can benefit from that spread. But ultimately, we have to look at the airline's ability to absorb a much higher rate because it's a cash cost. And can they pass that on to consumers? And if they can't, back to Richard's beautiful chart on realized prices of aircraft, that's going to be even more pressure on Boeing and Airbus for new aircraft prices to offset that incremental higher cash cost. But to be clear, we don't want to be a Chicken Little moment here. 25 basis points, 50 basis points when aircraft lessors are having debt at 3.5%, that going to 3.75 is not a big deal. Right. But if that goes to 6, 7, 8, I mean, that's when we would be in an environment where that could be an extreme pressure on the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe back to Bill, I mean, what's it mean for a highly levered business, a highly levered supplier, a highly levered airline? One of the mid-tier guys or gals who got through COVID on PPP payments, and now that's not there anymore. So what's it mean for them? So
I'll actually have, I think, a surprisingly positive comment here. Because it's easy for me to, the numbers can lead you to say, as rates go up, values of companies come down. I mean, it's kind of textbook, right? I mean, we've all had that class and done the math and run the models. Rates go up, the price of the company should go down. But anecdotal, which is always dangerous, right? Large numbers are better than small. But anecdotally, we looked back to sort of test this out. And again, we're a small firm doing small deals. This is not to be maybe applied across the market. But the highest valuation deal we ever did, most money for earnings, was in 2007. That wasn't that much larger than our next largest deal, but it was still, it stands out. And in 2007, I went back and looked at prime, and it depends on the month, it changes, but the prime rate was 7.75, and we did the highest valuation deal we ever did. Now, times are different, that's unique, all the rest, but we're talking about Chicken Little, and we're going to go to 3.75. Oh my gosh, valuations are going to plummet. And there's truth to that. Valuations should come down when rates go up. That's for the textbook, right? But if we're doing the best deal we've ever done at 7.75, we have a lot of runway.
Yeah. And maybe, Kristine, maybe at one point go a little bit off script here, but I know you know the answer to this. How do the defense stocks tend to do in a rising interest rate environment?
So it depends on how much, right? Because and you know, that's a tee off because that's work we did together. I was with Ron for 12 years at BAML. He's a great mentor and friend. So we did that work together. It depends because there was a point in time in 2008, 2009 when Lockheed's dividend yield was 5%. And so in a rising rate environment, the question is, you've got income investors owning these stocks when you've got a 5% dividend yield. Today in this environment, Lockheed's dividend yield is about 3%, and then the average of LHX, Northrop, they're about 2%. So it's a question of are investors owning these names for income? And if they're not, maybe it won't be as affected going forward. But in 2009, that was a big deal because 5% when you can then own, if you expected treasuries to go up higher. And also, right, in my entire career on Wall Street, there's been expectation that interest rates would go up. And it hasn't really done anything for 15 years. So that's really the tie to that. And so here going forward, I just don't think it'll be affected by interest rate.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I would add one point that's maybe a little scary. Is we haven't seen rates go up meaningfully in a very long time. Mm-hmm. And we haven't seen meaningful inflation in a very long time. And, I'm not Bank of America's economist or anything. I just sort of watch from the sidelines. But as kind of Richard pointed out earlier, I'm pretty, what's the word, bearish on inflation. I think it's going to be around longer than we think and we hope, and it's probably going to go higher than we think and hope. But we'll see. Next thing I think we need to talk about is rising fuel prices. And let's do this one as a little bit of a jump ball. We can all kind of talk about this. Are rising fuel prices a catalyst for airplane orders, an impediment to the recovery, somehow both? Maybe we'll just kind of go down the line. I mean, Bill, what do you think?
So from the vantage point of that small supplier, they're focused on probably not even Boeing, but someone between them and Boeing and their health in production rates. Or you could be an MRO provider. My guess is there may be some MRO providers in here in which you're the front of the market, right? The airlines fly more and you immediately see a benefit to your business. And so there's a little bit of bifurcation, but if fuel spikes a little bit, non-event, transitory, not a big event. Fuel breaks 100 and stays there, right? It will change the market. It will cause airplanes to get grounded earlier that are older, and it will force the airlines to try and buy newer aircraft to save fuel. So that has repercussions really both in those markets, both in the MRO market, where you may see less maintenance on older aircraft as newer aircraft come in, and the inverse on the production side, production goes up. If fuel prices stay cheap and you're an MRO provider, then business is going to be good because I came in on actually, where's Richard? Is he here? I came in a middle market Boeing airplane today. It was a 29-year-old 757-200. And it was a perfect competitor to the A321. It sort of looked like an A321, but it was 29 years old, right? That plane will keep flying if fuel stays cheap, right? Because it's not a bad airplane when fuel's cheap. So the answer is bifurcated market, and the smaller players are going to hope that if you're an MRO, you want really cheap fuel. And if you're in the new production, you want fuel to go up, but not so much as to curtail airlines' travel profitability. That Goldilocks, I think, is what Richard calls it. I don't know, what is it, 80 a barrel? Something like that.
And in terms of costs, at the end of the day, it's about profits. Are airlines profitable? And this goes back to work we did too. Airlines tend to order aircraft when they're profitable. When they've got cash burning in their pocket, they order airplanes. And so with fuel, it depends on whether or not they're profitable at that level, because if you just look at the overall picture, so pre-COVID again, fuel is about below $60 a barrel, and it's about 20% of airlines' costs. But around 2013, when fuel was over $100 per barrel, fuel costs became more than 50% of airlines' operating costs. And that's when they started charging fuel surcharges for passenger tickets, because they couldn't survive with that increase. So if we're in an environment where you have inflation, but consumers are strong and they're willing to absorb that higher price and airlines are profitable, you'll see aircraft orders still trickle through. But if that pricing increase in fuel is not passable to customers, and you start seeing airlines lose significant amount of money, then probably that aircraft order activity slows down. So I think that's the balance, right? And I think the work we did too is about $80 a barrel for oil, and interest rates at around 3%. It's a really happy medium for profitability and aircraft orders. But then for the leasing companies, when fuel dropped to $40 a barrel, I mean, AerCap made a killing on that ILFC order book, because they bought that fleet for when oil was over $100 per barrel, and they wrote off all those aircraft at basically they're not going to return back to service. And at $40 oil, they came back and made billions of dollars on that deal. So I think net, it boils to, are airlines profitable at that price? And if they are, everything's going to be fine. And if they're not, things will slow down.
And I think the point I would add is, a point that I think Richard's made before. When you're in a high fuel price environment and money is cheap, you've got every incentive in the world to buy a plane. When you get into an environment where money gets more expensive, even with higher fuel prices, it gets more difficult to order airplanes. So I think that's something to bear in mind. And we'll see how that plays out. But we got into, I think it was in 2013, almost the perfect environment. Interest rates were very, very low. Fuel prices were very, very high. Almost 5% of the fleet got retired that year. So it was sort of a landmark year in fleet retirements. We'll see how this plays out ultimately.
But Ron, I'll just jump in and say that although everything I agree with, and those were pretty good times for production, anybody in the room who has some or meaningful MRO exposure, those weren't great times. For the reasons that they were great times for others, for the MRO folks, it was softer times.
Yeah. So back to Bill. So I think this is an important question, and this came up, I think, many times during the worst of the pandemic. Why haven't we seen more bankruptcies?
Yeah.
And I think Kevin yesterday mentioned, that they were potentially expecting to see AeroStrategy, maybe some more coming up this year.
Yeah.
What happened, and why not? And and why aren't we seeing more M&A? Right?
My older brother is a bankruptcy attorney. That's what he does for a living. And talking with him right when the pandemic was hitting, and he was expecting to be just swamped, and convinced me that we really should step up what we call 363 sales, which are M&A through bankruptcies. And so there were 5 of us, I guess, got together in my firm and sat and talked about, this is tragic, but we got to get to work and we got to help the market. And there was nothing. And in fact, the statistic that I love to give out was in 2020, there were 30% less bankruptcies in the United States than in 2019. I mean, think about that, right? 2019 was a pretty good year economically, right? There were 30% more bankruptcies than there were during the pandemic. And the reason is, and without making any statements about politics, because I'm not going to do that from this stage, trust me, but our federal government really did some great things economically, and I'm just going to make an economic statement from the political spectrum. The CARES Act, which everybody knows about, and everybody knows about Section 1102, which was if you had 500 employees or less, you got a PPP funding, and then there was a second round of 300 employees or less, and they really worked. I mean, all the economists are saying it was a great move, helped our country, helped our people. It was just good, right? May have caused some inflation, but it kept people at work, right? And it was critical to our industry, right? I mean, I don't know how many companies here didn't get PPP funding, but I think we can all agree it was good for our industry, okay? Good politics. Section 4013, most people don't talk about, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to say I really understand this, but there was a section in the CARES Act that was called, quote, temporary relief from troubled debt. And it was through the Office of the Controller, and I do not study commercial banking and all the rest of it, but what it said effectively was, and I've read it, I don't really understand it, but I've read it, and it effectively said that during the pandemic, banks should not seek to foreclose on bad industrial loans, and that if they have to take reserves to hold against those as required by the control of the currency, all those requirements are waived. And so I'm not smart enough to know, but my brother explained to me that between the PPP funding and the change in the banking rules, there was zero incentive. In fact, there was disincentive in this country for bankruptcies. And my understanding is that the CARES Act is now gone, that these waivers are now coming, they're being removed, removal of a waiver. And so bankruptcies should happen, but anecdotally, our clients, we don't have one client that's over leveraged. Every single one of our clients, we're a small firm, but every one of our clients took that money, delevered themselves, and either have really nominal debt or truly no debt right now.
Yeah. And Kristine, I mean, what feedback have you heard from, some of the companies you cover? Because you cover some, mid-tier, small cap suppliers.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what Bill said, I mean, their balance sheets are surprisingly really good. Leverage across the mid-cap A&D is very low. Most are investment grade. I mean, the only supplier that's high yield is TransDigm, but that's a very specific TransDigm decision to be a highly levered company, not because they're distressed. The most stressed balance sheet that we see happens to be Boeing. But for the supply chain, pretty healthy. They're Howmet generated positive free cash flow, did through last year, did this year. Spirit seems to be in the path to positive free cash flow. So leverage is pretty low. And then also what we're hearing is the defense companies, if they have suppliers that do aerospace and defense, they know that volumes in aerospace are depressed and they're stepping up. This year, Lockheed's working capital got worse by $1.5 billion, similar to last year, because they're doing more customer funding to keep their suppliers afloat. So it seems, and Northrop's doing something similar. So the large defense primes are stepping in to some degree for the supply chain. And what you can see across the board is that days sales receivable and just cash conversion cycles have been decreasing. Pre-COVID, I mean, there were some suppliers who weren't getting paid for 120 days, right? And we're starting to see that get back to 90 days, some below 90 days, because preserving their ability to ramp up. So that's actually pretty good. That's healthy. And that's why Wall Street's a little excited, saying, okay, well, production rates are going up, air traffic's going up, everybody should generate a lot of cash, and investors want that cash in terms of dividends or buybacks.
So that's a good segue into the next question. I'll start with Bill. I mean, what are you expecting your clients to do with their capital? So when you think about the mid-tier suppliers, from a capital deployment perspective, what are you expecting?
So asking the question, are they, because we live and breathe selling of companies. So when people say capital to me, I think of exiting capital and turning liquidity. Is that the question? Or
yeah, that's fine. That's
okay. So I would say it's a bifurcated market. On the defense side, we've been advising our clients that are on the right platforms, right programs. Since the pandemic hit, we've been advising companies to go to market. It's not a bad time to sell. We did a number of deals last year that were well priced, well received. The defense market, especially for the right platforms, is very healthy. Multiples are good, and if you want to retire, sell your business, it's a good time to do that. On the commercial side, I've been pretty vocal. In fact, I was picked up by Michael Bruno, who you guys know well, at Aviation Week. And we've told some specific clients, do not go to market. That are in the commercial stream, and not that we don't like doing deals, but we'd rather sell a company for twice what it's worth in 2 years than half of what it's worth today, just being long-term greedy. And so we've been advising since the pandemic hit, stay off the market. And in terms of capital deployment, I think we're about to turn the corner. And whether there's another Greek letter, as Richard says, to this darn pandemic or whatever happens, I don't think it's going to be a smooth swoosh or whatever. I do think it's going to have bumps and lumps, but I'm very optimistic, and maybe just because I want to be optimistic that we're getting out of this thing. Yeah. And without trying to understand science, I just want to get out of this thing, right? I think we all do. Yeah. And so assuming we get out of this thing, and assuming the worst is behind us, I mean, HEICO's trading at a 62 PE, right? You know this better than I do, Kristine. It's at a 62 PE. And so either people are stupid and mispricing HEICO, which it's not a hard company to understand. It's been around forever. It's a great company. Most people who invest in HEICO know exactly what they're doing. It's trading at a 62 PE because the PE is going to come screaming back at some point, and then it's going to be back to a market PE, right?
Never a market PE.
But it's going to come off 62, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
it'll come off
50.
62.
Maybe 50. But the point is that I think we're all itching for this to come back and expecting it to come back. And so we're thinking that whether it's 23, like was just forecasted, or late 22 or early 24, I think it's just around the corner that we're going to see a lot of capital activity, sales of commercial aviation companies, because it'll be a decent time to sell again. And I don't think it's that far away. And maybe I'm just too optimistic.
And Kristine, what are you picking up from companies on earnings calls and so on and so forth about what they're saying about capital deployment?
And Ron, right, there are two different buckets. You've got the large caps and you've got the mid caps, and they've kind of got slightly different priorities. On the large cap, what we saw is the Lockheed Aerojet deal was blocked by the FTC. And it's an interesting one because the concept of the merchant agreement for the rockets are the same as the Northrop Orbital ATK deal that went through 5 years ago. It's the same exact thing. And so it seems like the political environment for larger scale M&A and the defense primes and the larger companies are looking at this, that the political environment is not supportive of large scale M&A. And so, and couple that with a dynamic where defense stocks in general are trading at a 20% discount to the S&P 500, and you've got upward pressure on the defense budget, a lot of these companies are just pivoting back to the classic share buyback and dividend increases. I mean, Lockheed's been saying that they might even look at debt because Lockheed's leverage right now is 0.9 times net debt to EBITDA. If they lever up to something like 2.5 times, that's $16 billion of potential capital they could use for buybacks. And, you know, that's about 16% of their market cap. They're about 100 billion of market cap. That's a pretty meaningful amount, and that's what they did in 2010, so it's not unreal to think that they could go there again. So there's a pivot to buybacks, and if you look at share authorization as a percent of market cap for these large primes, we're talking, you know, 8%, 10%, and they're pivoting really to that buyback portion, particularly because their stock's attractive. For the mid-cap world, there's such scarcity. I mean, if you look at what they all say, they all want to grow. Grow. And growth is hard to come by when you're dependent on air traffic recovery and production rate increases, which seem a little uncertain. And they want to buy companies. But if you talk to them, they just say the pipeline's not good. There aren't available assets or not for the price that they're looking for. And which means that if they can't find anything to buy, if you look at Curtiss-Wright, they've said they want to grow by M&A. Crane and their valuation's pretty terrible. Like, they're all trading below 2019 recovered numbers on 2025 expected growth. They're pivoting towards buybacks. There's a lot of cash in that industry, and so for shareholders, that's what they're really looking for. But for M&A activity, it just seems that scarcity and high prices and expectations for these assets, because that's what you're advising to do, which is hold off and get a better price later.
Sorry.
Nothing's getting done, and that's good for shareholders because you get more buybacks and dividends.
And to give everyone here, if they haven't followed it, perspective, in the period of 2010 to 2020, Northrop brought back half of their free float.
Wow.
Yeah.
Half.
Wow.
So, you know, when a defense company decides that they want to start deploying capital into buybacks, they can do it in pretty meaningful ways in terms of their free float. We've got 13 minutes left, and in light of that, I want to open this up for some questions. If we don't have questions, I have more, so rest assured, we'll fill up the whole time. If you want to ask a question, there's a microphone right in the middle. So why don't you, if you're willing, go up there and ask the question. And if you don't mind to introduce yourself, that would be great too, because it's always nice to know who you're talking to.
He needs no introduction.
Good to see you all, and thanks to PNAA to bring us all together. So if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what I hear, Michael Bruno with Aviation Week, by the way, what I hear is that industry sounds relatively healthy from a financial perspective. But please put it in your own words. The real question I have is, in Washington, we continue to hear bits and pieces of advocates here and there talking about the need for the government to become more involved and to have more of a stake. in the industry, whether it's setting up some kind of Fannie Mae type organization to backstop particularly defense and space assets, or more of a need to step in and help Boeing with some kind of cash for clunkers or subsidy for new airliner production, something along those lines. Can you bridge that gap between a healthy industry and the advocates calling for more government ownership?
Let me start. How can I frame this? Without getting political, it's almost impossible to answer that question. So let me just frame it that way, and I hand it on to my esteemed panelists.
Kristine, you want that hot potato?
I'll try. How about this? We talked about the health of the supply chain and their balance sheet, that you've got supplier, everybody's hating on investment casting, right? How much generating cash? John Plant said in the earnings call, he's not getting any phone calls from other CEOs saying that there's a casting problem. So some parts of the supply chain for these mid-caps are generating cash. They're positive profit. But that's all underneath the Boeing umbrella. And the state of the industry, ultimately half of it, but most of it in the U.S., particularly in this region of the world, depends on Boeing's future. And Boeing today has a net debt, a balance of $40 billion. Consensus numbers for expected Boeing free cash flow from today to 2025 varies from something like $30 billion to maybe $50 billion if they're bullish. I don't think anybody's looking at a cumulative 60, but kind of 50 is the balance. I mean, that's a debt load that extends through 2025. And industry health is dependent on Boeing's health, because ultimately, if we want to see growth, we need to see the 787 start delivering. We need to see the 737 MAX start delivering. So I think that health issue really is a question of Boeing issue. And if Boeing's not healthy, the industry in the long run won't be healthy. So that's my my non-political answer to your question.
And I'll try to stay as apolitical, but I'll try to be a little upbeat. I'm saddened, right? As an American, I'm saddened that Boeing is not as great as it once was. I just am, right? And I think we all are, including Boeing. They've made mistakes. I mean, they've just made mistakes, and they are not as great as they once were. But again, I'm sort of an eternal optimist. I believe Boeing can turn itself around. I mean, look what Boeing did with the C-5 program, right? And I'm old, people, so I remember these things. Boeing launched the C-5 and blew it, right? The C-5 Galaxy went to Lockheed. Boeing bet the ranch. And then it had this clunker of a 747, which no airline in their right mind would take. And they convinced, Ron Tripp, I think, to take a couple for free, basically. And it turned into this massive moneymaker for 3 decades, right? And so, Boeing has been on its knees before. What was the famous billboard? The last one out of Seattle, turn off the lights, right? Yeah. Right? So, I mean, Boeing has made mistakes before. This is a high-stakes game. And there have been some great books written about it. And Kevin Michaels has a great book about the duopoly in Boeing and the history of this industry. Boeing is in a bad place right now, and it's hurting all of us. And, Michael, your question's a great question. The industry's doing well. Balance sheets are good, but Boeing has screwed up. And it's screwed up a few times. And we're all suffering. I really believe that. Right? Their production rates are well below Airbus. It used to be a duopoly of 800 a year pre-pandemic, and Boeing is now, half of Airbus's production rates, give or take? Boeing, I think, will come back, and we'll all feel better. But Boeing is in a bad place, and it's got to pull a C-5 recovery. And it's basically in a failed C-5 position right now. Yeah, I mean, it's, I agree with both of you, right? I mean, it ultimately becomes a question of incentives. So if Boeing were to be quote unquote bailed out from the government, I don't know in the end how much that actually helps the industry. Truly, right? So in our written product, we've been reasonably critical of Boeing, but that's just because we want them to succeed, right? And that's our motivation, right? That for it to be a really good long-term investment, they have to succeed. So from an investment perspective, that's how we take it. And from a DIB, right, Defense Industrial Base, right? I mean, from national security, right? I mean, our country could defend itself if Boeing fails. It could. But I'd feel more secure at night knowing that Boeing didn't fail and that our national defense industrial base has got a strong Boeing in it. And so forget the economics of the commercial side, just national defense. I don't want to see Boeing fail.
Yeah, I'm with you. Any other questions? Somebody. If you can hear the mic, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks.
John Hemmerdinger from Flight Global. And I apologize, maybe you've addressed this, but what are some of the main choke points? I hear a lot about hiring troubles and inflation, as you mentioned, and the shortage of parts like castings and forgings, which was just mentioned also. And then you folks are saying there's general health. So where are the real pinch points or areas of concern that you're seeing? Can you just touch on those and how it relates to those other challenges we're hearing about?
I mean, so currently with low production rates, some of the suppliers are still, at 18, 19 per month for 737 MAX production rate in 4Q21. At that rate, some of these companies are actually cash profitable. So that's where the health comes in. And the choke point is if they're going to get to 26 per month, where Boeing is now in the MAX production, get to 31 per month, and potentially higher to 35, 40. Do we ever get back to 50? I don't know. I have it in my 2026 model, but that seems really, really far away. Can they get there? Right? So today, I mean, there's a boatload of inventory. I guess not boatload, plane load, airport load. You've got, 337 37 MAXs sitting in a parking lot somewhere in this area, right? And you've got 100 787s. I mean, the choke point's not now because you've got all those production, like finished goods, sitting in inventory. And then in the supply chain, you went from some were already 57 per month to nothing. And so the choke point's not there because there's all this slack in the supply chain. But right, as a just-in-time industry, when you get to a full rate of production and you absorb all that slack, it's a delicate dance. Everybody's got to be at the same rate. And if one person fails and makes a misstep, the airplane can't be delivered. And, we saw that even with, engine shortages where you've got aircraft with cinder blocks underneath the wings there. So I think that's the concern. It's really about the ability to meet the production rate increases. And from an investor perspective, the cash that you're expecting these companies to generate depend on volume. And if they can't meet on that volume, it's a free capital market. You don't have to own aerospace. You can own the, ping pong companies or the, the pool companies. I mean, right? I guess there's a shortage of pools, and inflation and people pay up. So I think that's where the concern is. It's not for the right now. It's for to get to this 2025 recovered normalized run rate.
And don't forget, it gets really complicated because as their biggest competitor does ramp, the supply chain's dynamic, right? You want to take care of your best customer. So, resources will go to the other guy or go to other industries. Right? So you're in this weird position where effectively Boeing has Lufthansa in their inventory. They don't have an inventory problem right now, but when all that clears out, where are the workers going to be? Right. Where's the supply chain going to be? Where are raw materials going to be? So
it's really the timing, right? I think we saw it with the pilot shortage, and it's not that there's a shortage of airplanes or there won't be enough pilots, although there is technically truly a pilot shortage. But when you ramp up suddenly and you weren't expecting people to travel at TSA 2019 level numbers, and they just show up at the airport, I mean, literally in a matter of 4 weeks, you can't ramp up fast enough. And so the airlines were canceling flights all over the place because they couldn't staff them up properly. And that is transitory, whether it's transitory inflation or not, but it's transitory in terms of labor shortage. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is that when Boeing really ramps up rates, there could be choke points. There probably will be choke points. But right now, it seems like it's relatively distant, yes?
Mm-hmm. Because there's just a lot of inventory. They got to deliver those airplanes to their customers, get them out the door.
they're swimming in airplanes, sadly.
Flying in airplanes?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Swarming.
Drowning in airplanes. Question.
Yeah, this is a multi-tiered question. Mike Cuddy from Prospect. Pulled out of Ohio, but multi-tiered. I came in kind of late, I apologize, and you may have already addressed this, but you did mention something about the multiples are good. And as you go down that trail, how does that compare to pre-pandemic when the multiples were obscenely good in some cases, but they were also tied to some single source OEMs. So what's the definition of a good multiple in your mind, number one? Number two, how does that relate now to putting all your eggs in those one baskets as we did pre-pandemic? What is the profile of a good acquisition? What are you looking for as far as diversification of that company?
That's a lot of question. I'll take one piece of it and let my colleagues take the rest. Your question was, what's a good multiple? And the answer really that we give to our clients is it really should convert to dollars. And you can do ratios, and they should be done. But which earnings? What were your earnings? Were they added back? Were they adjusted? Were they from 2 years ago? Are they forward earnings? Right. So a good multiple on good earnings is a really good number. A good multiple on low earnings is a bad number, and a low multiple on great earnings, right? So what I would say is this. We are not at 2019 levels in the commercial aviation supply chain. We were down 40%, give or take, in our little private markets, not public markets. We were down about 40%. So a company that traded for $20 million before the pandemic, we're getting values in the $8 to $10 million offer range, and we would tell our clients, don't do that. We're not back to $20 million. Whether it's because earnings aren't back yet or multiples aren't back yet, it's still, you're going to retire with your $20 million. You're not going to retire with a multiple, right? So what I would say is that we're not back to the 20 number. Next year, this year, fourth quarter, year after, ask Chris Zeltruda. He's the guy who's going to buy these companies. So he knows right now what he's thinking and what he's going to pay. And he will pay you more in 6 months than he will today. I promise you that. But exactly what Chris will pay you, I just don't know. Right, Chris? But without being flip, the answer is values are going to come up. And it's going to be for two reasons, right? The sentiment will go up, so the multiple will go up. And your earnings are going to go up. And your earnings are going to go up again as we come out of this recovery. And so I do believe we're still depressed, and I think it's just around the corner, I hope, that we're not depressed.
That's great. So I think with that, we're exactly out of time. So that timed up pretty well. So thank you all for taking time to share with us this morning, and thank you to my panelists.